The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission received an NC Cares Humanities Relief Grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council to execute this series. You can learn more about the North Carolina Humanities Council online at www.nchumanities.org. Funding for NC Cares has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act Economic Stabilization Plan.
I'd also be remiss if I did not thank the team that made today possible. Adrian Nearday, Associate Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, Kima Lassiter, Arts and Outreach Coordinator for the Commission, as well as Erica Johnson, a graduate student in the History program at North Carolina Central University, and Joel Cook, an emerging professional. Both Erica and Joel's work on this webinar series is being funded through this grant. I will also note that today's webinar will be available via a recording, so all participants will receive the link. You can learn more about upcoming webinars in this series online at ncaahc.nc.gov or via our Facebook. You will surely want to join us for our next webinar on October 22nd at 1:00 p.m. Documenting and responding to COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter in your community. In the meantime, I am thrilled to welcome our presenter for fundraising in the age of COVID-19, Anna Barber. Anna Barber is President and Principal Consultant for Barber and Associates, a boutique fundraising consulting firm focused on helping nonprofit organizations achieve their full fundraising potential. The firm specializes in campaign and fundraising strategy planning, major gift officer professional mentorship, and fundraising trainings. Prior to starting Barber and Associates, Barber was a senior major gift officer for the Smithsonian Institution and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where she worked for 8.5 years. She was part of NAMOC's inaugural fundraising team that surpassed its $270 million private philanthropic goal by $50 million. The Smithsonian, Barber spent 10 years working as a frontline fundraiser in college athletics at Michigan State University, Miami University in Ohio, and Arizona State University. Barber earned a Juris University and a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science from Howard University. She is also an avid traveler and a scuba diver. Anna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar on the development process and fundraising in the time of COVID-19. I want to thank the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission for pulling this webinar together and for being so diligent in ensuring that its member institutions are prepared to get through this very, very difficult time. So welcome to everybody. So this presentation is, it's been modified from what I generally do as a board presentation to nonprofit organizations. But it'll take you through kind of the planning stages of what I think of from a fundraising perspective. Okay, let me get, for some reason, there we go. Okay, so this is the agenda for today for this presentation. The first section will really go through kind of fundraising, preparation, and planning, which I find is very critically important as organizations begin to think about having conversations with donors about philanthropic gifts into their organization. So we'll kind of look at the steps and processes that I believe organizations should go through prior to actually having conversations with donors. And if you're already in conversations with donors, making sure that you work through these steps, simultaneously with those conversations. The second section of this presentation will look more specifically at the actual execution of fundraising and some of the strategies that different organizations can employ to steward and solicit donors. And then the third piece of this presentation, which is very short, just really kind of looks at fundraising during the pandemic, and I can kind of give some of my perspectives on what to do during this time. So jumping right into fundraising preparation and planning. This is the recommended infrastructure that I give the nonprofits that I work with. So as you think about fundraising preparation and planning, it's very important that your organization go through a process of determining what its aspirational vision and goals will be. I think a lot of organizations kind of skip over this process, but I find that it's critically important for this process to be undertaken so that you can begin to share with your donors and prospects where you want your organization to go into the future. And so I start the presentation with a very just kind of an example of a made-up organization, but giving your organizations an idea of what this process looks like. So the example here is there's an organization in North Carolina that has the goal and objective of diversifying museum exhibitions and content across the state of North Carolina. Well, that's a pretty lofty, big goal, right? There's lots of museums, there's lots of cultural institutions, cultural heritage sites. So how would an organization begin to diversify all of the exhibitions across the state? So I would recommend that an organization go through the process of having conversations internally about what strategies may actually work to be able to accomplish this aspirational vision or goal. So aspirational goal number one, looking at the programs that can help develop, this strategy. So developing, packaging, distributing diversity packets that every museum in North Carolina can adopt. Now, under that goal, there would also be very specific initiatives that would enable this organization to accomplish that specific goal. Now, these are not things that are done over a period of 2 weeks, 2 months, but a period of years. So thinking very strategically about, okay, what are the pieces of the puzzle to be able to develop the programs to help diversify museums, exhibitions, and content. Goal number two, looking at a technology goal, because we all know that technology can broaden the reach of an organization. So I kind of gave an idea of a technology initiative, developing and investing in a large scale database of content that museums across North Carolina can access. So if this organization is able to build a system that all museums across North Carolina can tap into with webinars and information and what have you on how to incorporate diversity and inclusion, accessing content that they can incorporate into their exhibitions, that is another strategy for being able to accomplish the overarching goal. And then aspirational goal number three, really building out a staff. So establishing a fund here, this is kind of the approach that I took here, and an organization can decide what approach they want to take, but establishing a fund to hire and support at least one diverse curator at every museum in North Carolina. So if you are able to establish a fund and hire, an African-American curator at every single museum, you are aspiring, you are demonstrating that you have the potential to diversify every museum and exhibition in the state. So this is just an example, but this is what I think organizations really need to do to begin the planning process and really develop their organizational strategy. And these are things that donors will want to buy into. So the second phase is really turning kind of your aspirational goals into a much more formal case for support. And a case for support is basically a document that articulates what your organization currently does, what you're raising money for on an annual basis, and really developing the narrative to make the case for additional support down the road. And these categories here that I've highlighted are kind of the critical components of what make up a case statement. So in a case statement, you should always have your mission and your vision very clearly articulated. Next, you should be able to articulate the uniqueness of your organization and differentiate what you do and what others do in a similar space, and why organizations should be so interested specifically in the work that your organization does. I also think that it's important to begin to highlight the successes, like the track record and the timeline and the successes of your organization, because people want to invest in projects and initiatives and organizations that have had success and that will continue to have success. So I think it's very important to highlight those success stories, and also, highlighting, success stories of the work that you're doing, yourself, as well as donor stories. So those can be included in success stories. Defining what your needs are. So if we go back to the last slide here, under each of these kind of aspirational goals, 1, 2, and 3, really defining what the specific needs of those initiatives are. So what are the needs that you will need to get the programs in place? What will you need to get your technology in place? What kind of system do you need to develop? What kind of staff do you need to hire? And then from, an aspirational goal number 3, the staff, how much money does it take? What types of staff members do you want to hire? How are you going to build the relationships with the museums in North Carolina? So really defining the needs. But within the needs summary, you have to be able to articulate and justify why those needs are so important. So really developing narrative around that. The cost and the budget is also very important. So as you begin to develop each one of the initiatives under your goals, you want to be able to, have some sort of idea of what the cost of those projects and initiatives would be, so that you can come up with a comprehensive fundraising number, right? So for instance, when I was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as Angela mentioned, we were ultimately responsible for raising $270 million, which went up significantly. And we ultimately ended up needing to raise $350 million in private philanthropic support. But we were able to articulate all of the different costs that made up that $350 million. Sorry, not thousand, million, $350 million. Now, I will say most of the cost, most of that $350 million for the museum was specific to capital construction projects. But as the museum opened, other initiatives came up, including different programmatic initiatives, staff initiatives, travel programs, what have you. So making sure you have a cost and a budget for all of the projects and initiatives you're proposing. And then, just before we get to goals, but really being able to demonstrate if a donor is interested in investing in your project or your organization, you need to be able to articulate what the impact on your organization will be with their support. And then lastly, all of this really kind of makes up your overarching goals. But really defining what your goals are critically important in a case for support. And this case for support ultimately should be turned into a collateral piece, whether it be a physical collateral piece or a online collateral piece. It is important. I have 3 examples of different case statements in this presentation. And I don't know if I'll be able to, no, I can't get to them while I'm sharing my screen. But I would encourage you to look up a website called issuu.com and type in a Google search case statements issue. And it will bring up all of these different case statements that Issue has published like online. And you can begin to look at the different components of what different organizations put in their case statements. And I selected these 3 because they're mid-sized organizations. And they did a really nice job of putting all of the different components of a case statement into this structure. So I would take a look at these as kind of a model for what your case statement should look like. But as you can see from the front covers of these case statements, images are a big part of this. And images are going to be a big part of telling the story throughout the case statement as well. So it's not just narrative. There are a lot of images to really conjure up different feelings and ideas and aspirations for your organization. I also believe that organizations should be investing in a database or a CRM of some sort. But if you're not at the point where you're ready to purchase a database or a CRM, because they can, run, they can be expensive. There are some that are not as expensive. So if you need recommendations on databases that would work, I'm happy to share that information after the presentation as well. But this is the type of contact information that you should be keeping on your donors. So if you don't have a CRM, make sure you have an Excel spreadsheet with columns where you are documenting this information, including all of the donors' contact information, biographical information. You should be recording gifts by year. So it's not just a lump sum of money. Like, you should be able to demonstrate or be able to show each year how much your donors have given to your organization. If your organization accepts pledges, the pledge payment schedule should be recorded so that you can send pledge payment reminders on a regular basis. Contact reports are also very important. So a contact report is basically documenting the conversation between the donor and the organization. So if you have a conversation with the donor about a potential gift, you should be recording what was said in that conversation and the outcome of the meeting, so that there is a documented history of the relationship between the donor and the institution, so that the person that comes after you've left an organization, can go back into the system and look at the historical record with that particular donor. If you've conducted any type of research, or any of your board members have relationships with these specific donors or prospects, that should be recorded in the system. And as I mentioned before, there are many options for different databases, and they vary vastly in price. So we do have some recommendations on databases for smaller organizations. Prior to you setting up your organization for fundraising, you want to make sure that you have your state registrations in place. So an organization or nonprofit that fundraises must be registered in every state where you are soliciting philanthropic gifts. And I think a lot of smaller organizations kind of overlook this point, but it is important to make sure that you have your state registrations in place. There are firms that can assist with making sure you're registered. But if you're only registering, like if you're soliciting a majority of your donations from the state of North Carolina, just make sure you're registered in the state of North Carolina. I mean, I don't think you need to register in all 50 states if you're focused on North Carolina prospects. But if you are doing work across the country and are soliciting a significant number of gifts across the country, you do need to make sure that you're registered in all of the states where you're soliciting. Nonprofit status, your organization should be registered federally and within your state. as a nonprofit 501c3 in order to be able to offer tax-exempt status to your donors. So making sure your organization has a 501c3 or is working under the umbrella of like a foundation that can serve as a umbrella organization. And I know that North Carolina has donor advised funds and other foundations that can serve in this capacity, just making sure that you are affiliated with those if you don't have your 501c3 specifically. So from there, after you've kind of worked through the case statement, you've defined your goals, you know what your fundraising objectives are, I find that it's very important to determine what your fundraising strategy is going to be. Are you going to go into a campaign or a major gift program, which really is a finite project that has an end date on it? So, you know, over the next 5 to 7 years, we're raising money for X, Y, and Z. Typically, campaigns or major gift programs are used for capital projects, endowments, or program-specific initiatives that have a time-bound kind of a time-bound, I'm blanking on the word, but end goal. And generally with major gifts, major gifts are generally considered larger level gifts that can be made in gifts, you know, one-time gifts or pledges over a period of years. At all of the institutions that I've worked at, except for one, the major gift threshold was $100,000 over a period of 5 years. So really, you know, defining what your major gift is for the organization. I did work in one organization at Miami of Ohio where a major gift was considered $25,000 over 5 years. So really kind of understanding where your organization is from a maturity perspective and defining, you know, what your major gift threshold is and whether or not you need to go into a campaign. The other type of campaign is an annual fund. And generally annual funds are supporting the unrestricted needs of your respective organization. Now, although you're raising money for unrestricted needs, you still need to be able to articulate what the current projects and initiatives are that your organization is working on. So whatever your standard programs are, at least be able to like summarize in a very short paragraph what all of your programs and initiatives are, so that when you have a conversation with a donor, you can articulate very, very clearly and complement it with a collateral piece of all the initiatives that you're working on. We can't assume that donors know what we're working on all the time. So with the annual fund, it really is, your money is going in to, you're asking for money to support the unrestricted operations, but you're articulating what your unrestricted operations are. And generally in an annual fund, you're going to be soliciting gifts at much lower thresholds. So the $25 gift, the $100 gift, the $1,000 gift, the $5,000 gift, the $20,000 gift, depending on the size of your organization. From a planning perspective, here's what we call, this is one type of pyramid that we use to kind of give people guidance on how many donors you can expect to have in each one of these categories. So generally, I mean, this is the perfect model, basically. If you have, you know, a large number of small entry-level gifts, that's perfect. And as you go up the pyramid and you get to higher level gifts, the number of donors actually declines. But as you can see on the right-hand side of this pyramid, the smaller level gifts really get less engagement from your organization. So if you're giving $25 or $100, your CEO or executive director is not going to spend much time with those specific donors. But as you go up the pyramid, say you are you have, you know, 5 or 10 major gift donors that are giving, you know, 100,000 or more to your organization, you really want to ensure that your CEO, your development professional, if you have one, are engaging with that donor much more personally. So this just kind of gives, and then planned gifts are at the top, which are gifts that come from a person's estate. And before you even ask for a planned gift, you really have to work your donors through this pyramid, up through this pyramid. But as you get to planned gifts, I mean, you really will be engaged with the donor. So just from a planning perspective, this helps. Here's a sample major gift pyramid for a $1 million goal. So this is really helpful when you're thinking about planning for a campaign. So you've decided, you've developed your case for support. You've said, okay, here are the initiatives that we want to raise money for. We've put our budget together, and we believe that we need to do a $1 million campaign to reach our objectives. So you want to put it into something called a gift pyramid, which will show you how many gifts you need at each level in order to reach your goal. And this particular gift pyramid is using a 4-to-1 ratio, which means there are 4 prospects that you need to be in conversation with for every 1 gift you expect to close. So you really do need to get a little bit comfortable with no's or people that just don't respond to your request. But the more mature your organization is, the lower your prospect to donor ratio will be. The less mature your organization is, meaning you don't have the personal relationships developed with your donor base, the higher your ratio will be. So 4-to-1 is a good ratio to use, but this will give you a roadmap for where you need to spend your time. If you have a $1 million goal, you should really be spending a lot of your time during the quiet phase of a campaign. So before you go public with anything, trying to identify those donors at $500,000, $250,000, $100,000, before you start trying to solicit gifts at like the $10,000 range and below. You want to get between 70 to 75% of your goal before you announce your campaign as going public. This is an example of an annual gift pyramid. And if you need to raise money over a period, $250,000 on an annual basis. So it's let's just say your annual operating budget for your particular organization is $250,000 a year. In order to raise that $250,000 a year, here is a roadmap for the levels of gifts and the type of solicitation that you need to be considering. And this, again, just gives you kind of a roadmap for where you should be spending your time. Your executive director in this particular gift pyramid really should be spending your time at the $10,000 plus level. So you see here, you only need 8 gifts, but a CEO or an executive director's time is extremely valuable. So you want to be as focused as you can on the relationships that they are building with your donors. And then other people can engage in some of the solicitations below that. You'll see here, I have a board giving campaign at the $5,000 level. I actually think that $5,000, even for a small organization, is a reasonable board goal. It's just a matter of including it in your bylaws, having an upfront conversation with your prospective board members before they join the board. And this doesn't have to be, all the time they have to give $5,000 unless they can, but it could be a give or get. So if they can't, give $5,000, maybe they have relationships with other prospective donors that can give it. So setting those thresholds, I think, are very, very important. I also believe very strongly that putting in place a donor recognition and benefit structure is critically important before you start the solicitation process, because you are able to articulate with your donors what benefits they will receive as a result of their gift at a certain amount or above. And this is a really simplified donor recognition and benefit structure, but I wanted to show you kind of what it looks like. And one of my recommendations is with your benefits, think about ways in which you can integrate the donor into the life of your organization. So if they're giving $10,000 plus a year, can you take them on a tour of your site Or can you have a really high-end like reception with like a state representative that supported your initiative as well? So really thinking about ways in which you can engage your donors with your organization through your benefit structure. But it also systematizes how you engage your donors after they've made a gift to the organization. Because it costs more to acquire new donors to an organization than it does to keep the donors you already have. So having this in place gives you a system to use. There's no ambiguity. You know what your staff needs to do on an annual basis. So now we'll turn it over to fundraising execution specifically. So this is a typical donor continuum. So the process always starts with identification. You're identifying who the potential prospects would be to support your organization. Once you've identified the prospects, it goes into cultivation, which is basically the engagement process with the donor, then solicitation, the actual act of asking for a gift, and then the fourth stage, stewardship, which we just looked at with the donor recognition and benefit structure, and then it continues. It just continues in a cyclical cycle. The objective here, keep your donors going through this cycle so they can continue to give, larger and larger and larger gifts to the organization. That's the objective. So now we'll go through each step of this a little bit more in depth. So when you're thinking about identifying your prospects and donors, there are different tools that you can use. For individual donors, corporate donors. So at the very top, the best way of identifying prospects is through your own network. I think people overlook the power of the network that they have. And honestly, this was the way we built history and culture. I, for instance, was sent to the state of California. No relationships, and the museum didn't have very many donors at the time, and the Smithsonian as an institution really hadn't done a great job of diversifying their donor base when the museums, when we started raising money. So we had to build our prospect base from scratch. So I really worked very diligently within my network to begin to identify who I should be talking to in California. And I would literally go out to California with a folder, have meetings with these prospects, and I would directly ask them, after I pitched the museum, I would directly ask them, who do you think in California has the $100,000, $25,000, and I would write the names of the prospects on my folder, and then I would bring it back to the research or at the Smithsonian and ask to vet whether or not the names they gave me were like legitimate at the levels that they said, which gave me, and then I would work diligently on building relationships if they did come back, rated at a certain level. Additionally, there are research firms that can assist with identification of prospects. I do recommend that your organization subscribe to the local business journal and your local newspapers, because there's always information in there on individuals, corporations, or foundations within your community that have been making gifts. So just keeping up to speed with what's happening. Goals. One of the strategies that I used in building or identifying a prospect base in California on behalf of the museum was I went to the Museum of the African Diaspora and the California African American Museum in LA, San Francisco, CAM is in LA, and I went in there and I just literally took a picture of their donor walls and then sent them to research to begin to identify which ones I wanted to solicit. And a lot of them ultimately ended up being donors to the National Museum. Now, that may seem like poaching somewhat. So I did do my due diligence and introduce myself and build a relationship with the director of both of those museums so that I knew what their fundraising objectives were as well. And when I was pitching donors that had supported either one of those museums, I would pitch both the National Museum and the local museum and their projects and initiatives, and I would demonstrate why both institutions were critically important to, you know, our futures. And that really went a long way with both the museums as well as the donors that I was in conversation with. Lastly, with like individuals, your organization can actually purchase lists from different firms of donors that have given to similar type organizations. It's not a cheap acquisition process, but it is a possibility. I know the museum, the National Museum did do that. And then for foundations, you know, really looking at the Foundation Center and GuideStar. Getting into the cultivation of your donors and prospects, again, you can see on the right-hand side, the larger the donor, the more immersive the experience will be. The smaller the donor, the less immersive. But on the left-hand side, it basically says the best practice is you really should have 7 touches with the donor before you make a solicitation, right? So these are different ways in which you can touch your donors. You can touch them through regular communication or letters, publications, events within your organization, phone calls from organizational leaders. So not just like internal staff or your executive director, but also board members or beneficiaries of the work that you do. I know at Michigan State, we had a really extensive student calling campaign where the students at Michigan State would call prospective donors and talk about their experience and then, you know, make solicitations. So you can engage as many people in this process as you can. You just have to make sure you have a script. And then personal visits are generally reserved for much larger donors or large donors that are, you know, relative to your organizational donor base. Here are some other methods of cultivating your donor base, basically just bringing them closer in. So campaign committees, boards, host committees. We used host committees very effectively at the museum, very effectively. And I would love to get in, well, I'll give you one story. So it was leading into grand opening. And one of our signature donor levels was the 2015 Society. And those were for donors that were given between $25,000 and $100,000. And we had built so much momentum and had really, you know, generated a lot of interest in this 2015 Society. And so people from across the country were calling and asking to host, you know, 2015 Society events. And so, you know, we just didn't have the capacity leading into grand opening to be able to like host all of these people and all of, you know, the people that they wanted to bring in and encourage to support the museum. So what we did was we sent invitations to all of our 2015 Society members, inviting them to co-host with the museum a 2015 event that was going to happen at American History. I think 6 months before grand opening, or maybe 4 months before grand opening, but it was in a space that overlooked the museum. And the objective of the host committee members was, one, you had to make a $25,000 gift yourself. So if you hadn't already made one, you can make one now. And then two, we want you to help us bring in 2 more donors at $25,000 or more. We got 16 co-hosts at the time. So we only had 90 2015 Society members when we thought about this idea. We got 16 co-hosts, people to agree to you know, uphold what we requested of them. And then we dropped invitations in March. The event was in June. We opened in September, so that gives you kind of an idea of when we were supposed to open. And we closed $2.5 million in $25,000 gifts in that time period between March and June, because we had people working for us at the $25,000 level. We were using leverage to close gifts. And as part of your donor recognition and benefit structure, you could be recognized on a wall within the museum at that $25,000 level. So there was a lot of momentum. But not only did we raise that $2.5 million in that March to June time period, people were so excited about the grand opening after this event that they committed, we got another $2.5 million in commitments. So literally in a 4-month period of time, gifts, 200 plus gifts at that $25,000 level. So when we opened the museum, we had 354 donors at 25,000 up to 100,000. That's unprecedented, but we used what we had, the tools in our toolkit, very effectively. Advisory committees are a way to go. If you have the opportunity to incorporate job programs into your work, that's another way to cultivate donors. Special events, always a great way to cultivate donors, but generally with special events, you want them to be free. You don't want to charge for tickets. You want to ask them to make a gift, and as part of their gift, they are being invited to these special events. It's a very different philosophy, but it's a much more philanthropic approach to fundraising. And then donor recognition. Again, this is really just kind of like encouraging you to work through connecting with your donors. So prepare yourself, familiarize yourself with your donors' backgrounds, interests, and capacity. Connect with them 6 to 7 times through. Again, the higher level donors, you connect with them in person or on the phone. The lower level donors, you're connecting with them through newsletters, events. And then for your executive director or your development professional, aim to schedule 3 to 5 in-person meetings or calls every single week. That sounds like a lot, but it actually requires this and more to get you to your goal. The 4 methods, the traditional methods of solicitation, verbal asks, written proposals, giving appeals. For the larger donors, again, you really want verbal asks in person or by the phone, or written proposals. For the smaller donors, direct mail solicitation letters and online giving appeals are absolutely fine. Rules to remember: do not get impatient and leave money on the table. Far too many people do this. They feel like, oh my God, they haven't done the 6 to 7 touches. And so they're just like, okay, I'm gonna just ask for this gift on our first or second meeting. That may not be the appropriate time. And you may be asking for too little. So don't do that. Actually go through the process of cultivating the relationship so that you're not leaving money on the table. If a donor has the capacity to give you $1 million, do not ask them for $25,000. You want to make sure you've cultivated them so you can actually get that $1 million. After you've made an ask, be quiet and let the donor respond. Too many people, they're so anxious that they just made this solicitation. Oh my gosh, they keep talking. But it's time for now the donor to reflect on what your request was. Okay, so just be quiet, let them think about it. If you get a no to your solicitation, ask them why. There's lots of different reasons for why someone may say no. It could be that, it's not the right time. Maybe their philanthropic portfolio is too full right now. Maybe you're not making the right ask. You're not asking for the right thing within your organization. So ask why. And then again, don't ask for too little. The purpose of stewardship, really the last piece in this process again, is the process of thinking and showing appreciation to donors for their support of your organization. And making sure that the donors are engaged with your organization after they've made a gift. As I mentioned before, it costs more into your organization than it does to keep the donors that have already supported you. So make sure you are engaging them after they make the gift. Do not let them fall off the face of the earth. Stewardship activities should be tied to donor recognition and benefit structures. So there's a systematized way to engage your donors. So fundraising during the pandemic. This is a really quick slide, but let me tell you, donors on cultivating or soliciting, you need to be out front talking about your organization, talking about your plans, need for philanthropic support. And with this chart, I just wanted to show like some of the very specific organizations that have publicly made statements that have said that they are willing to support arts and culture organizations and or racial justice initiatives and work. Now, there have also made public statements saying that they are going to do this, but if you have a relationship or you have a connection to one of these organizations on this list, I highly encourage you and begin to cultivate that relationship so that you can make a solicitation. Okay, and then what to do specifically. You know, identify all possible connections between your organization and a potential funder. Does your board have relationships, staff, key donors, congressional members? Who has the relationships? Identify them and work them. You know, if you haven't finalized or started your case for support, you really do need to work through that process. And if you can articulate, you know, any type of like COVID-19 relief or racial justice work that your organization is doing, you know, include those projects in your case for support. Schedule Zoom calls with all of your current top funders. So even if they haven't made a gift in 3 years, 5 years, whatever, schedule a call to have a conversation with. Again, do not pull back right now. This is the time to put your foot on the gas. And then continue to ask for philanthropic support at the same levels, if not higher, than where you were asking for support for before. And then, you know, especially if maybe your organization had a gala that had to be canceled this year, but just a rule of thumb in general, do a year-end appeal. Make sure that you are communicating with your donors like at the end of November so that you're included in their year-end gifts. So that's all I have for right now. I'm happy to stop and take any questions.
Yes, wonderful. So we actually did have a couple of questions that came in through the chat. The first one being, what are your thoughts on a campaign with no established goal? The idea is to get as much money without restriction.
Okay. I actually believe even if it's like you're soliciting for unrestricted support, you still have to identify and articulate what you are raising money for, like what you're going to do with the money. And I also highly recommend that you have a campaign goal. So you do need projects, you do need initiatives, you need to budget them out. You need to know what the total cost of those things are, because a donor is going to want to see your progress. A donor is going to want to know if you've actually accomplished what you say you're going to do. So I always recommend a case statement with very clear objectives and fundraising goal. Even if you have like different initiatives, you can ask for unrestricted support. You don't have to ask for individual projects, okay? But you still have to have your projects listed and a goal, you know, kind of to strive for.
Absolutely. I also want to take the opportunity for folks who are listening in. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll continue addressing them now. The second question that we received was, does registration address solicitations of foundation or corporate support from those outside our state of registration?
My interpretation of that question is yes. I would consult you know, your attorney or like a foundation in your state just to confirm, but my interpretation is yes.
Again, folks, feel free to type your questions in on the chat. We did have a little bit of a brief conversation between us at the commission before the presentation started, and we're having a quick discussion about, from your perspective, how do you go out and have a comfort level to make these big asks? Like, where do you kind of prepare for that?
So I will say it has not. When I first started soliciting, I mean, I've been in this game now for 20 years. So it's, you know, I've refined my skill and like, I'm very comfortable making asks at this point. But when I started, I was not comfortable. And I actually had to I did my first solicitation with the director of development at Arizona State that I was working with. And, she encouraged me to develop a proposal, and, I knew that we were going to be asking for a certain amount with this couple, and we both went in together to the meeting, and I talked through the proposal, sort of. It wasn't so great, but, hey, I tried my best. And then when it actually got to the point of me making the solicitation, I choked. And she stepped in and she made the solicitation, and we ultimately ended up getting the gift. But what I saw was, okay, it's not so hard to actually make a solicitation. And as I have evolved through my work, each step of each gift size is harder. Like when you ask for your first $10,000 gift, when you ask for your first $100,000 gift, when you ask for your first $1 million gift, $5 million gift, $10 million gift, there's more fear. It's so weird. I don't know why. But anyway, my philosophy is to just suck all that fear into the pit of your stomach and get your ask out. Begin to articulate the needs of your organization, and at the end of your conversation, get the ask out. All they can do is say no. Nobody's killing anybody. Nobody's harming anybody. Like, the worst they can do is say no. But if you don't ask, you don't get. And we have to understand that when we're talking to very wealthy individuals or corporations or foundations, don't think that they are in the same place as you from a financial perspective. We're not in the same place. And so somehow you have to help, you have to begin to change your paradigm around what their true, net worth is. They have far more money. Just accept it and be comfortable with that ask.
Wonderful. We got a question of how do you recommend establishing a relationship with a donor who does not know you yet?
Okay, so it's always helpful if you have like now it depends if you're talking about an individual, foundation, or corporation. But fundamentally, if you have anyone that's affiliated with your organization, from a staff member to a board member to another donor, anyone, it's helpful to be able to like name drop. This person recommended that I call you on behalf of this organization. They said that you may have an interest. But always, in a call or an email or whatever, you really need to articulate what you're going to talk to the donor about in a clear and concise way. So you're not writing 5 paragraphs about your organization on an intro, email. You might write like maybe a paragraph, and then you put in the email, I'd like to schedule time for an initial call. And then, because they don't know who you are, your email may have gone to junk mail. Maybe they just forgot to respond. You need to continue to reach out to that person, whether by email or by call, until they respond. But if you have a connection, drop names for sure. I name drop all day long.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on limited engagement with donors because of financial limits? How can you put on activities that keep donors involved with limited money or resources?
So I would think about like building into your donor recognition and stewardships and donor recognition and benefit structure, cost effective and efficient ways of like engaging with donors. So, is it feasible for your organization to do a bi-monthly or biannual newsletter updating people on what's going on? It doesn't even have to be a physical newsletter. It can be an electronic newsletter, but like that is a way of touching a donor. And it doesn't cost that much. It just costs time. There are other ways, like if you want to give something, or maybe it's like you're at a park. Maybe you represent like, a state park. Maybe you offer like walking tours with a member of your team. Now, it does cost you some staff time, but if a donor is giving you like $1,000 a year, that might be a way to like engage them at a low cost. So you're not serving drinks, you're not serving food, you're just saying, come and hear from one of our experts. Or like this, a webinar. doing webinars with experts is a great way to engage your donor base at a very low cost. So there are different ways. You just have to think about, you know, what your available tools are.
Absolutely. Do you have any recommendations of some small database technology that smaller institutions and galleries might be able to afford?
So what I will do is I will send Angela and Erica an overview of a few databases that might work well. I've worked with like salsa labs with smaller organizations and I like it, but I do have a chart which will give you like the price structure of like 5 different databases. So after we get off this call, I'll make sure to forward that and then you can forward it with the presentation.
Wonderful, absolutely. The last question that I'm seeing right now is also starts with a statement: case for support is essential, but it is a challenge for small, mid-sized organizations. May this be a single-page document, build it to a multi-page document eventually. There are essential elements, but love that you stress the value of images. Do you have any further comments on this?
Yeah, so I actually think that cases for support don't need a ton of narrative. So if you can do, you know, a page or really like 2 to 3 pages is a good length of content. And then, you know, complement it with images and pictures. That can get you easily to a 10 to 12 page like case for support. But one of the other reasons why I find it's very helpful to have a case for support, even for a small organization, is if you are applying for foundation grants, the language in your case for support actually can be cut and paste directly into the applications. So you don't have to like recreate language to fit into your applications. So you're doing everything all at once. So when I think about cases for support, generally I encourage organizations to do longer cases for support that actually make the case for, you know, the project and initiative, and then cut it down significantly for your published hard copy or online case for support, so that really you can just cut and paste. I mean, you're going to save yourself a ton of time in the long run if you do it out at the outset.
Wonderful. So we're getting close to time here, so we will take just one last question. If there is a mid-sized or small institution that does not have the capacity to hire a varied development team, example like a grant writer, a donations relations manager, etc., how do you suggest they effectively fundraise?
So I would take a look at the team internally and figure out like who can do what. You know, is it your CEO or executive director that's doing a bulk majority of the solicitations? You know, is there a member of your team that can carve out, you know, 25 to 50% of their time to focus on development? You know, I would also, and, you know, I haven't done research on this yet, but I think it's important. I want to do research on which foundations will actually provide capacity grants to hire for development professionals, because I do feel that it is important to have a development professional on your team. Now, perhaps, you know, like perhaps the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission could actually come together and hire one development officer for all of the institutions that you represent, and then all of the institutions pay in for, you know, development assistance. I mean, you've got to get creative, but you've got to have someone kind of focused on it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. One last thought about that. Sorry. For a small organization, don't focus on the small gifts. If you don't have much capacity from a development perspective, go for the larger gifts. Focus your time on the larger gifts, because you don't have the capacity to do, you know, a whole bunch of them. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I just want to be sensitive of everyone's time here. Anna, thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation. I think you offered a array of resources for the various institutions that were able to attend today. Folks, if you could keep an eye out on your email, we will be sending a brief survey that will help us as we continue our planning for the remainder of our CARES webinar series. And please do take a look at our website for more information, as those series will be presented between now and February. Thank you again.